Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to a couple of you. My name is Todd Macy. I'm the president of Vital Learning. We are based here in sunny Denver, Colorado. And today we're going to talk about making the shift, how to prepare your managers for the new hybrid workplace. So a couple things that I want to get into before we get started. A few logistic items. One, the chat box. If you hover down within Zoom, you can see that chat window. If there's any questions that pop up as I'm going through this, feel free to type that in. We probably won't have time today to address any questions, but we can follow up with you individually, as well as at the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you my email. So if there's any follow-up questions, discussion items, things that you want to chat about, certainly feel free to reach out. And happy to answer kind of any questions that you have related to this or otherwise. Also, tomorrow you're going to be getting in your email an ebook that takes you through kind of these key takeaways and the concepts that we're going to talk about today in this webinar. So certainly feel free to take notes if you want to, but we'll have a lot of this information and content that we're talking about today in the form of an ebook that you'll get tomorrow. So don't feel like you have to write down everything. All right, gonna start things off with a scenario and kind of put yourself in these shoes. I wanna kind of set the scene here. You are a manager of a team of 12 at a mid-sized organization. And let's put ourselves in the future. So it's 12 months from when COVID first hit the United States. So we're in March 2021. The work environment that you're in right now is quite a bit different than it was just a little over 12 months ago. While the threat of COVID has mostly dissipated, you've seen a lot of changes in your work environment. Some of the main things are that you're no longer 100% in the office. You have a more kind of flexible and hybrid work environment and schedule. Some folks are partially remote. There's a little bit more flexibility in terms of schedule. So in other words, not everybody on the team is kind of in the same physical setting at the same time frame throughout the day. And you found that is a really big challenge as a manager. A couple issues specifically that you're still just really struggling with. One is accountability. Folks in your team aren't in their seats anymore. They're not at a physical desk necessarily all the time. And so you feel like you really don't know whether work's getting done or not. You just kind of feel like you're flying blind a little bit. You're having a really hard time holding people accountable and getting work accomplished through your team, which as we'll chat about is one of the kind of key responsibilities that you have as a manager. Another issue that you've seen coming up is that you're having difficulty with the team staying in sync. You kind of just feel that people are in silos, and since you no longer have the benefit of kind of being all in one place together with this consistent schedule, you feel that the team just isn't kind of communicating effectively. People really aren't on the same page. There's duplicate work getting done because people aren't clear on what they need to do. There's some frustration where people feel out of the loop, and some of the members of your team have expressed those issues with you. So that's another big kind of challenge that you're dealing with as a manager. Finally, another big challenge that you have is you feel that your team just isn't really engaged anymore. Since you're not all in the same environment, some of those small conversations and ways that previously the team got to know each other better just aren't happening as seamlessly and as fluidly as they used to. So you feel like there's some engagement issues going on with your team. You can't quite put your finger on it, but your team just doesn't feel as engaged and as motivated. And there's kind of some piece of the culture that you feel of your team and of the organization that is slipping away. So I wanted to kind of give this scenario and this background context to kind of set the scene for what is going to be happening with a lot of managers. Many managers are going to be facing these kinds of challenges, both now as well as in the future, as the work environment moves to a really hybrid setting. We're going to talk about kind of what that looks like, what we anticipate kind of the future of work looking like, and most importantly, and really the focus of our webinar and of our discussion today is, what does that mean for a manager? and what can you do to help your managers prepare to effectively handle kind of this new future of hybrid work. So what we're going to chat about today, I want to first start off and give you a little bit of background context about industry impacts and how all sorts of different industries are being affected by COVID and how that's kind of shifted all sorts of different work environments. I want to give a little bit of background and context there. Going to chat about what is hybrid work, why we're going to be shifting to hybrid work, and what that's going to look like at a high level. Going to chat briefly about just skills that every manager needs to be successful within their job in any environment. And so these are really timeless skills that we're talking about here. So chat a little bit about that before we talk about 6 challenges that we've identified that specifically are going to be faced in this kind of new hybrid workplace. So these are challenges that as the workplaces shift, challenges that are either going to be unique to kind of these new hybrid work environments or are going to be amplified. In other words, managers might have been facing these kinds of things before, but these challenges are going to become all the more difficult and all the more prevalent in this new hybrid workplace. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to take you through 6 scenarios of these challenges that are going to come up more and more, and steps and suggestions, recommendations for what managers can do and how you can prepare your managers to effectively handle these kind of newly evolving hybrid workplace challenges. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and that is kind of the focus and the topic of this webinar. So let's get rolling. All right, so first talking a little bit about industry impact and how this is affecting different industries. Of course, there really isn't any industry or organization that hasn't been impacted in some way by COVID. Of course, some industries are more impacted than others, but COVID and this pandemic has really touched all industries in some way. There's not really a single business that hasn't been impacted in some way by COVID-19. So manufacturing is one of the industries that was one of the first to start to see the impacts of COVID-19 before it came to the US. And really the main kind of area of that impact was with supply chain. Of course, a lot of the US manufacturing companies have supply chains that are based out of China and overseas. And so as COVID was kind of hitting in that part of the world, supply chain issues started to come up. So manufacturing was one of the first kind of industries to start to see those impacts of the pandemic. And has certainly been one where a majority, and this is a recent stat, a majority of manufacturing companies are changing their operations in some way. One big example of how a lot of manufacturing companies are really having to change their operations is how the layout and the process and kind of the procedure of their manufacturing plant takes place. So depending on kind of what kind of process and what kind of goods are being manufactured, a lot of manufacturing environments had workers, standing close to one another. They're, maybe bumping into one another. They're kind of walking back and forth through different stations. And so that's been one area where a lot of manufacturing companies are re-looking at that. Some of them are completely reconfiguring the way that their facilities are set up to isolate workers a little bit more, so there's less contact between folks. And so then that means that less safety issues might arise kind of during this pandemic. So that's something that is being adjusted in the short term. But I think there's going to be a lot of long-term impacts. And of course, some manufacturing companies are completely changing what they are building in manufacturing during this time. Food service. The restaurant business and food service has certainly been one that's been in the news a lot. It's gotten a lot of media attention. And has also kind of had this really overnight evolution that's been forced by the pandemic. So prior to COVID, the restaurant kind of delivery arm of food service and delivering food to customers was a relatively small way of revenue source if you kind of look across the entire restaurant industry. And really overnight, that became kind of the required, and in a lot of cases, the only delivery mechanism that a restaurant could connect with their customers. So that of course has shifted things overnight. over 50% of the population has downloaded a restaurant-related or delivery-related app during the COVID pandemic. So that has really accelerated how people are interacting with restaurants. And I think that's going to be something that sticks around for a long time. When the kind of immediate threats of the pandemic have shifted, we're going to see some long-term changes in terms of what a restaurant looks like. And some of this stuff is already coming up. Starbucks and other organizations have announced that they're permanently changing the layouts of some of the restaurants and changing how the building itself looks to better accommodate for delivery. And that's something that they plan on as a permanent fix. So the way that restaurants kind of interact with customers, how online ordering is happening is going to be a big change in that industry. In healthcare, a really big change that we're seeing is the rise of telehealth. It's gone from something that was pretty much just a blip on the radar. Prior to COVID, there was very little in terms of telehealth happening. Less than 3% of people had any kind of telehealth in 2018 to, as of May, 23% of folks have done telehealth just during this pandemic. And I think this number has continued to rise. Really the two kind of key drivers behind that, one, of course, the social distancing measures and trying to keep folks out of confined areas. But actually, I think the bigger thing that's driving that is a lot of insurance companies and Medicare are now treating, at least temporarily, and probably some of this is going to parlay over into the long term, are treating telehealth appointments in the same way as a physical appointment, in person with a doctor and a patient in terms of insurance reimbursement. In other words, if a doctor visits a patient via telehealth, they're going to be able to get the same kind of insurance reimbursement as they were if someone was visiting in person. And that previously did not exist. And that is really going to allow for a lot of telehealth to happen. And I think what both a lot of doctors as well as people on the patient's end are going to realize is that, look, there's some appointments where I don't need to go into a physical office anymore. Of course, some kind of appointments require that, but there's plenty that don't, right? And so we're going to start to see that long-term consumer expectation begin to shift and evolve because of this rapid rise of telehealth in the healthcare industry. Hospitality. This is a really interesting one. Another industry that's gotten a lot of media attention because of how much they've been impacted. Something in hospitality, unlike actually a lot of other industries, is that cleanliness has always been the top priority for guests of a hotel. And this was long before COVID, was the most important thing about a hotel is it clean? I think the key kind of difference here and where we're seeing this evolve is cleanliness of the hotel is going from something that was largely, behind the scenes. Hotels would be set up purposefully to, not be having the housekeeping staff, working kind of behind the scenes, to now something that is conspicuous, overt, emphasized to show and demonstrate to guests of the hotel, look, we are cleaning the hotel. Cleanliness is really important, and we're doing it right in front of you, so you can see that this space and the room and the hotel in general is clean. So that I think is going to be something that continues on and has a long-lasting kind of process change within hospitality. I think another really interesting thing about this industry, it's one that really requires physical presence. In other words, unlike a restaurant where you can deliver food to somebody, or a lot of other industries where there's some kind of e-commerce or digital alternative that you can work out, it is not the case with a hotel, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of especially smaller and mid-sized hotel chains that don't have these cash reserves, who are going to have to completely rethink their business model and think about what they're offering. I could certainly see certain hotels, instead of having kind of the traditional setup like they had before, maybe adapting and evolving into a space that enables for kind of work from home setups, or evolving their space into a new kind of use. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this hospitality industry evolves over the years. Oh, another thing too, some of the larger hotel chains are testing out these machines, which cost about $10,000 each, but they can go into a room and allegedly disinfect the entire room kind of in one swoop. So some of the larger chains are testing these devices to help scale the cleanliness of the hotel and to do this, consistently throughout a guest's stay. Retail, of course, this is also evolving. So prior to COVID, if you look at retail, kind of how I saw it, there was kind of two distinct pathways with retail. There was the e-commerce, which has been on the rise, of course, for many years with Amazon and others. And then there's the physical retail space. There was a little bit of the merging of those, and we're kind of just starting to see that prior to 2020. Amazon was experimenting with some things. Warby Parker was starting to get into this space where they have both an e-commerce model and start to go into stores. So there's a little bit of the merging of the two, but that is, it will be greatly accelerated because of the pandemic. Some examples that we've seen. In April, I went to a Home Depot store. I ordered a couple items online, and there was a pickup locker that is pictured here. I just scanned the QR code that was on my phone. A locker just automatically opened up, got my items, walked away. So I think there's going to be a lot of these creative kind of hybrid solutions that more blend and merge e-commerce and physical retail that include curbside pickup, mobile payments, other types of these hybrid solutions that are happening in that environment. Business services, this is really kind of a broad catch-all category for a lot of companies that are outside of some of those other industries that I talked about. Some interesting things that are happening here. There's some stats that there is a drastic leap in digital adaptation with a lot of these other kind of more traditional office environment businesses. In other words, something that a company might have on their 5-year plan in terms of technology or other systems that they're going to be installing into their company. That was on a 5-year plan, has now gone into a 2-month, really, essentially kind of overnight adaptation. So a lot of these businesses are all of a sudden now having all of this suite of business tools and systems and new technology that's installed that they now have and will be able to use. So it's gonna be interesting to see how that kind of plays into how these companies work and how they do their business. And of course, there's a lot more emphasis and a lot more people are attending webinars. That's another thing that's been happening recently, sort of within the business services industry. All right, so before start getting into the other items and start talking about the hybrid workplace and start talking about managers and what are the situations that they're going to be running into this hybrid workplace, I want to take a moment and have a quick poll here. So I'm going to pull up this poll and would love to hear your responses and your answers and get kind of a pulse on what industries you're working in. So you should see a poll coming up on your screen here. It asks you what industries you're working in, what's your current work from home status and situation, and finally, is work from home, is remote work something that's new to you or something that you've been doing prior to the pandemic? So just wanted to kind of get a pulse on the audience here. We'll give about a minute or so for folks to enter those answers. All right, so starting to see these come in. A lot of businesses services, folks, it looks like. So we got some representation from manufacturing and healthcare, so that's great to see. All right, give about another 10 seconds. So if you haven't answered this poll yet, please do so. Okay, so you should see the results on the screen. If not, just going to run through these real quick. So the majority of folks, 68% of you are in the industry of business consumer services. I know it's a really broad category, but close to 70% of the folks on the webinar are in that category. Pretty well spread out among the other remaining categories. Also a majority, 100% remote work. Some 35% already shifted into that kind of hybrid model, which we'll talk about. I think that's going to be something that's going to be more and more popular. So, my guess is if I ask the same poll to this, same group or similar group a couple months from now, those numbers would probably flipped. I think there's going to be a lot more folks kind of transitioning into that hybrid work environment. For now, a lot of folks are still staying 100% remote, and 81%, so the vast majority of folks started working remotely, either partially remote or fully remote after COVID. So in other words, what that means is that a lot of this group, a lot of people that are working remote are not used to that setting, which creates all sorts of challenges, as we'll talk about. So it's kind of a new environment, and that can be especially tricky for anybody, but I think especially for managers. So thanks everybody for everyone who answered that poll. And I'm gonna flip the slides again. And let's talk about the hybrid work environment and how that compares to the old office. So the photos, it's really interesting. I was going through this. The photos of these old office environments just feel so foreign now. They feel so strange, right? It just feels like so different. So let's kind of set the setting for what that looks like. The old office, a lot of office environments, a lot of companies were 100% in person. The old office means commonly working close together. A lot of these kind of office settings and work environments had an open floor plan where employees are pretty close together. That kind of evolved from and started in large part in San Francisco and with some of the tech companies. It was kind of the way that a lot of organizations saw as the best way to have a work environment. But within the last decade, there's actually been a lot of studies and data that's come out where the intent of some of those open office environments to be more collaborative and encourage conversations between employees, actually the opposite of that was happening. So less of those conversations were happening, less of that collaboration was happening in those open office settings and environments. I just think that's a really interesting side note there. But that was commonly what was set up kind of in this old office setting and environment. From a manager's perspective, they relied a lot on FaceTime and people being in their seats, showing up at the set work schedule. So kind of that 9 to 5, typically a lot of meetings that happened between teams, some of them pretty unnecessary. And so this old office environment, I think in a lot of ways, mirrored the beloved show, The Office. And we all know, or at least for anybody who's seen the show, how much work got done in the office, which was generally pretty little. I think a lot of office environments were at least a little bit more productive than the team was in The Office, the show. But regardless, I think it kind of highlights the kind of old office environment and some of the pitfalls of being in that setting. So let's look at the hybrid workplace and what has this pandemic, not just in the short term. I think the really key thing to emphasize here is that I think for a lot of organizations, their work setting, their workplace is gonna change in some way. Even if it's a little change, I think a lot of organizations are gonna see fairly significant changes in the long term. In other words, this is not just a kind of short-term shift during the pandemic. Things are going to go completely back to normal. I strongly believe that that even after the immediate threat of the pandemic has subsided, the workplace is going to look different in some way. And this is really the hybrid workplace, and these settings are going to change and shift and evolve from what we previously we're used to. And I think a lot of these changes, as we'll get into, are going to be for the better. So in contrast to that 100% remote, everybody is in the office on the same schedule, the 9 to 5. It's going to move in a lot of cases to a partially remote setting and workplace. In other words, Not everybody is going to be in on the same schedule. Schedules are going to get more flexible generally, at least when they can, for a position that enables that kind of flexibility. There's going to be a partial remote work. In other words, some folks are going to be in the office, part of the week, work from home the other parts of the week. And I think that's going to mean, both from a cost management perspective, as well as just, what employees want. A lot of employees want that flexibility, and that's been a piece of data that has been resounding for, especially the last decade and 5 years or so. Flexibility is one of the most important characteristics that a lot of employees value in a work environment. So environments are going to start to shift to there. The offices are going to look a little bit different, I think, in a lot of cases. So instead of everybody having their kind of set desk, I think a lot of offices are going to start to look more like a library, where there are kind of general work areas and workstations. They're going to be more efficient because not the entire team is in 100% of the time. So that what an office looks like is going to really shift and evolve kind of in this hybrid workplace. There's going to be fewer meetings. Folks are going to be really more reliant out of necessity, and we're going to talk about this kind of as we get into the challenges that managers are facing. Going to be more reliant on metrics and results versus on face time. So that kind of gives you a flavor for this new hybrid work environment. Again, I think most industries, most organizations are going to be shifting into a workplace that, at least in some ways, looks different in the long term. And that's a really important thing to be keeping in mind, especially from a manager's perspective. How do you be effective and get work accomplished through your team as a manager kind of in this new setting? So let's briefly talk about some benefits and some setbacks, some downsides of this hybrid work environment. So I've kind of talked a lot about these. I'm just going to go through it quickly. Flexibility, more adaptability, productivity. I have an asterisk by those because it can kind of go either way. We'll chat a little bit about that as we get into the challenges managers are facing. Affordability, I think this is going to be a really big one. If you look at the overhead of a company, a lot of organizations, their two biggest areas of overhead are the employee salaries, which are, that's a good thing, right? But a huge expense and overhead for a lot of organizations is the workplace itself. And so to be more streamlined, to be more efficient, to have better profitability, how can you reduce that really large overhead expense, especially if it's something that the employees and the team don't really expect? So that's a really big benefit of this hybrid workplace. Having a better life balance that comes with that flexibility, and a focus on results kind of out of necessity of being in this new environment. Some challenges, I think a lot of these are kind of short-term growing pains that are going to happen and are going to come up in this future of hybrid work. It's a new convention. It's something for folks to get used to. There's going to be confusion around it, especially at first as that transition's happening and before kind of systems are put in place and routines are put in place. Of course, with any big change, there's going to be, in a lot of cases, resistance to it. Productivity, again, that can kind of go either way. We'll chat a little bit about that. One of the longer term impacts I think could be happening here is team cohesion and culture. If someone's not in the same physical setting all the time, the kind of conversations that just happen naturally are going to be more difficult and just not happen as frequently in this kind of hybrid work environment. So that's definitely something to be on the radar of and aware of, and one of the downsides and challenges of this hybrid work environment. So let's talk about, what does it mean to be an effective manager? So before we get into the 6 challenges for this hybrid work environment, I want to bring up and chat about what does it take to be an effective manager, kind of what is the story of the typical manager and the kind of key challenges and common challenges that they commonly deal with. This is my area of expertise. It's what my organization, Vital Learning, is focused on. That's really our specialty. So there's over a 30-year history. We've done a lot of research on this. So we know a lot about kind of what it takes to be an effective manager and the challenges that a manager faces and the frameworks that work to help managers overcome those common challenges. So just, you probably heard, something similar to this before, but just for a quick refresh, what typically happens, kind of the common story of someone going into the management position, they tend to be good at the technical parts of their job. And oftentimes that's why they're promoted into a manager, right? And as they move into that manager position, oftentimes they find that the management skills are a lot different than kind of those technical aspects where they're good at and they're comfortable, and they tend to really struggle. In kind of conjunction with that, a lot of managers don't get good practice, don't get a nice framework, and aren't given really the tools and the skill set that they need to be good at the management responsibilities. And so that's an area where they really struggle. And that means that managers have a really difficult time with essentially what they're tasked with, which is taking the vision of the company and executing that through their team, getting work accomplished through their team day to day through that consistent quality management. So that's kind of the story and the common struggle of managers. So I'm going to talk briefly about skills that every manager needs. These are really timeless and consistent regardless of what environment we're in. These are common skills that every single manager is going to have to be effective within their job. So first one, communication. Of course, it's critical that a manager can communicate effectively to their team and is clear and concise and speaks to what the team needs to know and understand. A good manager is involving their team in decisions. They are leading them effectively. They're developing folks on the team and making sure that the team members understand what their responsibilities are, feel valued, and can really make that connection between their day-to-day responsibilities and tasks and the success of the team and the organization. Good managers are motivating and inspiring. They lift their team up. Good managers really focus on coaching and growth and development of folks on their team. So they really take the time and put the effort in to help coach and guide individuals on their team for personal and professional growth. Good managers set goals and hold the team accountable for those goals. So as we'll talk about in some of the scenarios, managers are results driven and hold that team accountable, set those goals in a smart way. They're giving feedback consistently, both positive and negative, that enables that growth and enables that execution. They are handling situations that inevitably rise on the job, so they're able to resolve issues that come up, whether that's a conflict between the team members, whether that's a complaint that someone's voicing, whether that is some kind of other work habit related issue. They're equipped to handle those issues and also equipped to have difficult conversations with folks in the team. As a manager, you inevitably have to have hard conversations, and how you navigate that and how you approach it, and what you're kind of demonstrating, those core communication and leadership skills during those conversations, can make them a lot more effective. Finally, every manager needs to be able to navigate through change. Of course, within the last 4 months, there's been a lot more change kind of in the world itself, as well as in a lot of organizations, than has happened typically, but change is something that is constant. So if you look at these skill sets, these are timeless skills that every manager is going to need to be effective. What we're going to talk about is 6 kind of categories within here of situations and challenges that still really fall within these broad categories. Like I said, at any point, COVID or not, your managers are going to need to be able to do these things effectively. We're going to highlight and talk about some specific challenges and things that have been accelerated or are unique to the pandemic and this hybrid work environment setting. But before we do that, let's take a quick poll here. So I'm going to pull this up and just have a question for you about whether or not your organization is doing any training for your managers. see about 60% of folks have answered so far. We'll give another 15 seconds. Okay. All right, so here's the results. Looks like almost 50% of folks said, yes, we're doing manager training, but it is limited or reduced because of COVID. That is certainly consistent with what I'm hearing before. 26% of folks still doing training at the same rate prior to COVID. That's awesome to hear. And the remainder have not done any training in the past, or it has been completely paused because of COVID. All right, let's get into the 6 challenges here. I'm going to go through them real quick, and then we're going to dive into each one in more detail and to give some scenarios and some examples kind of behind those as we talk about it. First one, accountability and productivity. Second, adapting to changes. Third, employee grievances about the work setting. Fourth, communication, staying in sync with the team. 5, handling mental health challenges. And 6, maintaining and growing the culture and keeping folks on the team engaged. So these are 6 challenges. Again, they all kind of fit within that the broad categories that I mentioned before. It's kind of timeless skills and frameworks that an effective manager is going to have to be effective. But these are challenges and situations that are really amplified during this kind of hybrid setting and the shift over to the hybrid workplace. And some of them are, pretty unique. In other words, they're in a broad category that the manager might have had to face before, like dealing with change. But what they're dealing with specifically is pretty unique to this hybrid workplace. So these are going to be all the more relevant to managers. So it's super important that they're prepared and able to handle these types of conversations effectively. Going to give a quick poll before we jump into talking about the scenarios. And just interested to hear, which of these categories have you seen with managers at your organization so far? So you can select multiple of these here. Which ones have you seen come up in your environment? You have about 30 seconds or so to answer these. All right. Great. Thanks for everybody who filled out that poll. So it's a fairly even split between those. The 2 biggest ones that we see: adapting to changes, communication process, and culture are kind of all pretty similar and at the top of the list there. But we got a good amount of answers for all of them. So that really indicates folks are seeing all of these 6 things start to pop up in their work environment. I think it's going to just continue to happen kind of as we evolve to this hybrid workplace. So let's go through these and kind of talk about each one of these 6, just give you a little bit of background and kind of set the scene for what this might look like for a manager. And then talk about, what are steps that as a manager, someone can take to effectively address and handle this, and how can you prepare your managers to effectively overcome and handle these challenges. So first one on the list here, accountability and productivity. So with less face time and folks being partially remote, not necessarily in the office all the time, so a manager doesn't have a tool that a lot of managers relied on, and this was not a good tool to ever rely on. So I think this is a good change that's kind of forced to be happening here in this hybrid work setting. A lot of managers would see the physical presence of their employee at their desk and kind of use that as a proxy for they are being productive. And that was sort of the measure of productivity, is someone shows up on time, they sit at their desk, and they stay the entire day. Well, they're productive, right? Of course, that is not a good measure of productivity. And in this hybrid workplace, you can't really rely on that face time, at least not to the extent that someone could previously. And so what this is doing, what this is going to do, is it's going to expose the productivity or lack thereof of the team, and really require managers to rely on other things other than FaceTime to make sure that things are getting done. So a manager, if you think especially of a 100% remote kind of environment, a manager is only seeing the results, right? So how can we measure whether an employee is working and is accountable for their responsibilities or not? Also, a lot of engagement and trust go into kind of this new hybrid work environment and that relationship. So what are some steps that as a manager you can take to help with this accountability and productivity? I think a great first step for a lot of managers and teams, if this isn't already in place, is to create a weekly scorecard for each employee. And really the key kind of purpose behind that is to put down metrics and numbers and put data behind what each employee needs to be doing on a daily basis. Almost any job role, you can look at metrics and look at that as a way to help give guidance to their productivity. So creating these scorecards, ideally collaboratively with the folks on your team, is a great way to transition from FaceTime only as a measure of productivity to making it more metric and data-based, results and activity-based, which is a really, really great step to be taking if the team's not there already. Another important practice and recommendation to address this is to set and discuss SMART goals with your team. We talk about SMART goals in some of the Vital Learning courses and what those are specifically, but these are goals that we're setting for your kind of shorter term, and in some cases longer term priorities. And that both helps an employee with their priorities. What do I need to work on? And ensuring that, okay, if you have these couple projects that are the highest priority, you need to be spending a lot of your day on this. So that gets back into the results and the most important results, as well. It helps to set the expectations that you have for that employee. Not only just setting these scorecards and setting these SMART goals, but I think just as importantly is using these consistently in conversations and holding employees accountable for that. And if the numbers are off, especially kind of week over week, you need to have an open and honest conversation about what's going on, what's happening. So that can be a great way to open those conversations and to have it in kind of a productive way versus an accusatory way, right? If a manager is saying, well, you're not working, and they're just sort of making an assumption about that. We talk about that in our Essential Skills of Leadership courses in any type of conversation, but especially when it's a difficult conversation. It's really critical that managers focus on facts and observable behaviors instead of attitudes and opinions. That's one of our key skills of the Essential Skills of Leadership. That certainly comes into play here. And if you have that scorecard, if you have metrics, in other words, you have facts, that's going to make that conversation a lot more productive than sort of making the assumption you're not doing the work, that kind of thing, if you don't know that, right? So focusing on activities and results, that is a key kind of shift and mindset that every manager is going to make. It's important before, it's going to become all the more important in this hybrid work environment. All right, so second challenge here, adapting to changes. Of course, there's a lot of changes happening in this new environment. That's something that was the top answer from the survey. So in this example, there's a new procedure that's happening. Employees need to check the temperatures of anyone coming into the building, clients and employees. There's additional cleaning steps that are happening. There's a configured office layout. And really, all that is to say that a lot of folks in the team are feeling really overwhelmed by all of these changes. There's resistance to this. Well, this is unnecessary. There's kind of the growing pains that go along with adapting to those changes in the workplace. In a lot of cases from the COVID pandemic, a lot of these changes by necessity had to happen overnight. So a lot of new procedures and systems and routines and initiatives were installed because of the pandemic to adopt. And out of that, there's a lot, and it's kind of a, a natural human reaction. There's a lot of resistance and fear of that change. So as a manager, how do you guide your team through that change? How do you lead them through the change? And we'll talk about that with the steps. Of course, kind of hand in hand with that resistance, alignment and commitment. When someone is resisting the change, a lot of times they're not going to be committed and in some cases won't comply with that change. You want to get commitment out of your team versus compliance. So how do you do that as a manager? Especially when changes are happening quickly, a lot of times team involvement isn't happening. So that can really amplify all of those issues when changes need to be installed quickly without necessarily the input of the team, which of course is ideal, but not always possible. So what are some steps that as a manager you can take to better adapt and evolve to these changes? Being upfront and open and honest about changes, when they're happening, that's obviously a great thing to do. Explain the reasoning behind the changes. That can be a really great way to help folks understand, well, why are we doing this? And so if folks kind of understand the why and the reasoning behind it, they're typically going to be a lot more sympathetic to the change itself versus here's a new procedure, you need to follow it. Explaining that reasoning can be really, really helpful. Allowing for questions and concerns to be addressed. Clarifications. Some folks might not be clear on, okay, what exactly is expected of us. That happens a lot where there's this kind of communication gaps between who's delivering the message and people who are receiving the message. So taking steps to ensure that there's alignment, asking, to explain the procedure, asking on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you understand this? That can be a great way to ensure that folks are all on the same page. And especially if there's questions or concerns that are brought up, following up and checking in with your team about those concerns or about those clarifications is also a great thing to be doing consistently as a manager. Grievances that come up in the workplace. So let's go back to that manufacturing example that I kind of talked about in the beginning of the webinar, where a lot of manufacturing environments are having new layouts, and somebody is going from a layout where they were kind of close to other folks to being isolated, and for safety reasons, they are just in one part of the manufacturing procedure, manufacturing line, and they're isolated, they're kind of sectioned off from other folks on the team. What that means in a lot of cases for practical purposes is that folks on these lines are going to have to be doing additional duties where they might have had 1 or 2 steps in this process that they were doing along this line. If they're isolated, in a lot of cases, that means that now they're going to be doing additional things. They might be doing 3 or 4 steps now. So a common grievance that might come out of this in a manufacturing setting, I think a similar type of idea could happen in a lot of different cases, is that an employee comes and complains, look, I have 4 things to do now instead of 2 within this process. I'm not able to be as productive. It's, it's stressful. I just can't get my work done, that kind of thing. So those types of grievances are going to be more common as these changes are happening and as folks are shifting into this new kind of hybrid workplace. Another thing, and kind of the opposite side of the same coin really, is concerns over safety. So let's say safety procedures are put in place, but employees really don't feel safe in their work environment. They feel that the procedures aren't adequate or are not being executed well, or not being followed by folks on the team, that kind of thing. And so they don't feel safe in their work environment. So they're bringing that issue, that concern up to the manager. And with both of these types of concerns, there's a balance here that needs to be struck. And of course, employee safety should be the top priority, and that of course is very important. But in any case, in any of these types of situations, there is some kind of balance that is being made between safety and productivity and output. In other words, the absolute safest thing that you could do for employees is not have them be on the manufacturing line at all and not produce anything, right? That would be the safest option. But for the viability of the business and for job protection, of course, that for a lot of organizations is not a good route, or at least not a good long-term route to be taking. So how do you strike that balance between safety and productivity, and how do you communicate that? I think with these kinds of challenges, as well as a lot of these that I talked about, there's an opportunity here as well. It's a challenge, but I think you can also look at it as an opportunity, that the organization and the manager is able to express empathy and commitment, and not just say that, but show that in their actions by installing these procedures that make individuals more safe. And that can be a really great opportunity to show as a manager, as an organization, how much you truly care about the health and safety and well-being of folks on the team. So what are some steps to address these grievances? So I think one of these first steps, and this is kind of a preventative measure, whenever possible, it's really great to involve the team in creating these new work procedures. When folks are part of this process in creation, tends to be a lot more commitment to following them, and less likely that complaints are going to arise, and also less likely that the procedures are not practical or just don't work well. What happens a lot of times is if procedures are created sort of at the high level of the organization, people who are not kind of on the front lines actually dealing with whatever it is day to day, the procedure is not realistic. So if you involve folks on the team early on, not only are you going to get that commitment, most likely you're going to get a better procedure as well, because folks on the front line are going to know better than anybody what can and can't be done, and what's going to work and what's going to not work. So really important as a manager to involve your team in those types of conversations. Explaining the why and the challenge to the team is part of this. Explaining why we're doing this new procedure, whether it's safety or something else, or multiple things, and present the challenge. I think if someone really has a full understanding of the challenge, they're going to be both more empathetic and more committed to the ultimate result, especially if they're involved in that process of creating the new procedure. Proactively ask folks on the team for their feedback and suggestions. So don't just kind of sit back, as a manager and wait for somebody to complain. I think it's a really great practice to, especially if you're involving a new complex procedure, to proactively ask folks about that and take some time to chat with them about it. What's working, what's not, what can we shift, involve, what can we change, that kind of stuff. Ask for that feedback and those suggestions. Next up, communication process. And I have there's someone floating in space here, because this is kind of what it feels like a lot of times, to be kind of isolated. If someone is working remotely or in a hybrid setting, a lot of things that happen in that office environment just don't happen as naturally in a virtual setting. So those huge Zoom meetings, you see a picture of that there. It's hard to read those nonverbal cues. It's just more difficult, especially in those large conversations, to have a good productive conversation. There's more friction in those kind of informal chats if someone isn't in the same physical space. Schedules might not align as frequently if there's more kind of flexible work and different work hours, and partial remote work, that kind of thing. So it just allows for that communication to not happen as seamlessly. And so it makes a lot more likely that employees are going to feel isolated and out of the loop. They're not on the same page. So what can you do as a manager to address that? I think a first really good step is to assess the existing communication tools that the organization has. A lot of companies have video conference tools, productivity tools like Slack and other project management tools and other kind of automation and communication tools. But in a lot of cases, they're not using them much. So looking at what you have already is a great first step to kind of be thinking about this, gathering feedback from the team and working collaboratively to create those communication preferences, putting together that communication plan and making sure everybody is really clear on that, discussing it, and then evolving it over time. That's also a really important step. Certain things you're going to try out and they're just not going to work. So it's really good practice to be having that continuous open conversation and evolving those over time. Mental health challenges. Of course, this is a really difficult kind of area and a challenge to deal with as a manager. It's something that is coming up more and more, and is going to continue to happen. I anticipate, just kind of with the world we're in. over half of adults have reported some kind of mental health impact from COVID. So it is certainly something that's out there. And employee well-being by necessity includes their mental health. And it's a hard conversation to have. So a lot of companies and managers are really just not equipped for these types of mental health conversations. So what can you do to address them? I think a couple preliminary steps that are really good for managers to be thinking about and taking is, first off, creating an environment where it's okay to talk about mental health. It's out there, it's accepted. And one of the best ways to do this is to be open about the challenges that you've faced or are facing mental health wise, if you're comfortable doing that. That can be a great way to kind of establish that within the team and within the organization. Another good step is to educate yourself on mental health, educate yourself on company procedures as it involves dealing with these kinds of situations. Just get some good proactive background on all of this, and that's going to help be better equipped to have these types of conversations. And I think a thing just to be always aware of, especially now, but at any time, is just to be mindful and aware of your team's mental health. And that awareness alone can bring all sorts of positive impacts, start conversations, and start to address that where it is needed and where it's appropriate with folks in your team. The last challenge here, so that number 6 out of 6 is engagement and culture in this new hybrid workplace. You kind of have this a cheesy picture of folks at the water cooler. These types of kind of informal and more natural conversations where folks are 100% in a physical environment together just aren't going to happen enough. And so it can feel like, as a manager, and kind of the feeling of the team is everything is all business all the time, because it's all kind of transactional, because we're not having these kind of fun conversations, which of course get out of hand and harm productivity, but is also really important for team cohesion and the culture. So how do you kind of address this gap? A lot of the opportunities for this team cohesion might be going away or reduced. And in this transactional setting, people might not feel as engaged, and it's a really hard thing with someone onboarding, right? If they've never met folks in person, that can be a really, really difficult challenge, and something that organizations are facing right now. So what can you do to address this? Think about what the company's culture is and what's missing in this new workplace. Have conversations with the team about it. Think about how you can maintain the culture in a hybrid setting. So think about some ideas, discuss those ideas with the team, and really try those out. Just gather feedback and iterate. Some folks don't like the company happy hours, right? So the events that companies put on aren't all necessarily good and positive. So get those feedback on what works, what doesn't work, to help maintain that in the hybrid environment, because that is certainly going to be a big challenge as folks are no longer 100% in an office together. So final thoughts and takeaways. This hybrid environment, like I said, is something that's going to be affecting most organizations in one way or another. It's going to be a whole new area and realm of challenges for managers. The good news is that they all kind of fit within the categories of what we know a manager needs to be able to do and to be able to take action on, to be effective in their role. And it's just a matter of giving them the right tools and the right framework, the right practice to be able to handle these on the job. So if this is something that you have further questions about, maybe your organization or you are dealing with these kinds of challenges or anticipate these things coming up as kind of the company evolves, please feel free to reach out. My email is up there on the screen, so certainly feel free to send me an email, tmacy@vital-learning.com. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions if it makes sense. Happy to jump on a call and have a quick conversation and chat about this. So if there's any way that I can be of help, please let me know. Thanks everybody for attending today. Appreciate you taking the time and learning more about this. Hope you have got some interesting takeaways and some action items for you and your organization, and have a great day. See you everybody.